Hello and welcome to the driver demo. This will be our first dive right in end-to-end demo on SageMaker. Our very next module will go to more detail on the features of SageMaker. Let's have a look at this inside the console. I'm here inside my Cloud9 environment, and the very first thing I'm going to do is download the source code for this exercise. Let's unzip that. And that unzips to a few things. We have a file in there, training.py and inference.py. We plan to run the training file to train the car to drive along a simulated road. Let's do that right now. A simulated road is going to appear, and I'm just going to drive the car through the road. That has completed. And if we looked on the left here, we'll see this has created a CSV file. The CSV file contains in its first column the action that we took on each step driving on that road. The remaining columns are a representation of how the road looked when we made that action. We're going to take that CSV file and use it to train an algorithm. I'm going to right click on that, download it locally, and now re-upload it inside of S3, where it's made available for a SageMaker algorithm. We now have the file inside S3, and I can move on and create the training job inside SageMaker. We have now created the CSV file that we will use to train an algorithm. We'll go into the SageMaker training jobs and hand on that CSV to an algorithm supplied by SageMaker. Let's see what that looks like inside the console. I'm going to come in here and click Training Job. I'm going to call this job Driver Training. I already have an IAM role configured. This is what gives SageMaker permission to read that CSV file inside the S3 bucket. I need to select an algorithm. SageMaker provides several different algorithms, and in this case, we'll be using the linear learner algorithm. I can select that there. My input mode is file. That's the S3 location of the CSV file. I'm leaving everything else with the defaults. At this point, I now have to configure the hyperparameters. We are doing a multi-class classifier, which means that we have multiple different output states. We will return back a turn left, drive straight, or turn right. Those are the three different states that we will be inferring from this algorithm. Our feature dimension is 250. That's the size of the road that we are passing into the algorithm. And I need to bring down that batch size as we have a relatively small set of data. The predictor type is a multi-class classifier. And the one other thing I need to configure is down here, which is the number of classes. Remember, we have 3 different states. Now I configure the input data. This is the CSV file that we have inside of S3. The content type is text CSV. And there is the S3 location. And I'm going to use that same S3 location for our output. SageMaker will deliver some artifacts to this location inside of S3. We now have everything we need configured to create the training job. That will take about 3 minutes to complete, so let's come back to this when it has completed. Our training job has completed, and in our next steps, we'll create a model and an endpoint to talk to that model. Let's take a look at that inside the console. Let's dive inside the trainer job to see what completed inside of here. We ran for about 3 minutes, and this is the name of the container that we used to do the training. I'm going to copy that because it may come in handy soon. And at the very bottom here, this is the CSV file that we used to train the algorithm. all the settings were used, and down here is the artifact. This was the output from the training job. If I return to the training jobs, I can select the job and use this to create a model. Let's return to the training job and use this to create a model. I'm going to call the model driver model. It is already configured with an IAM role. The container is already configured for me. This is the image where the inference code will live. And also already configured for me is the location of the model. That was the output from our training job. I'm going to leave everything else with the defaults and create the model. Now that we have a model, let's use that model to create an endpoint. With an endpoint, we'll be able to talk to the endpoint and create inferences. I select the model and I say I want to create an endpoint. I need to call this endpoint driver endpoint. An endpoint also has endpoint configuration. I'm going to create a new endpoint configuration for this. Let's call it driver configuration. And the configuration actually determines the multiple models that we can send our inferences to. In this particular case, we have just one model. I click Create Endpoint Configuration, and that'll take a little while, and we can come back to that when it has completed. Our endpoint has completed, so let's jump into the console and see how that looks. I now have my driver endpoint here, and I can test it by running some code against it. In the Cloud9 instance, I have the inference.py file. And if we have a look in there, we'll see the code where I'm talking to that endpoint. Right here where it's highlighted, I'm talking to the driver endpoint. I want to invoke the endpoint, and I'm sending along a simulated road to that endpoint. Let's see how that looks. We can simulate either a random road or the sine wave road. Remember, we trained this on a sine wave road, so let's see how that looks. The response coming back from the SageMaker algorithm is saying turn left, turn right, stay straight, and is doing a pretty good job of staying on the road. We did train that with a sine wave road. Let's see how that will do on a random road. And again, we're getting back responses from the container saying, stay straight, turn left, turn right. And it's doing a pretty good job of staying on the road, considering this is not the road that we actually trained the algorithm on. So that is the end of our end-to-end demo that gave us a very quick introduction to some of the features of SageMaker.